This is the fourth episode of the Dissolving the Ego series. And in the first three episodes, we looked at who we were, the original face, who we became as the ego, and our return to the original face. In this fourth episode, we are going to start to look at some of the unfortunate vasanas and samskaras that we pick up in this process. Now, what I mean by vasanas is habits and latent tendencies. Vasanas is a Sanskrit word for that, and samskaras in Sanskrit means mental impressions or subliminal psychological imprints that we pick up. And this happens due to being the false ego, actually. A lot of these vasanas and these samskaras, which actually affect our karma, our actions and unconscious reactions. So in episode 4, we're going to speak about the element of restlessness, what is related to the vrittis. We often see the vrittis in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, but we see it all through the great traditions of the East. Vrittis in Sanskrit means this incessant mind activity or chatter we have in our mind, termed as kind of this whirlpool we have in our mind, which we get stuck in, and then we can't actually see into our true nature. They often use a lake as an analogy. So when there's a whirlpool or the water is disturbed with a lot of ripples, you cannot see into the bottom of the lake. But once the lake becomes tranquil, then you can see into the nature of the lake and you can see the bottom of the lake. And that's basically a representation for our mind. And so this is what is very important on the spiritual path, especially if we are talking about down-regulating the ego or essentially dissolving the ego. We need to look at this element of restlessness. Now, in the modern day, we are constantly agitating our mind, particularly due to digital technology, our phones and so forth and so on. And then you'll often see people tapping their foot on the ground unconsciously or tapping the table with their fingers and constantly moving. And this is a result of too much activity coming in through the senses, which agitates the system. And so this is where you need to develop a level of shamatha. Shamatha means in Sanskrit, and samatha in Pali both mean calm or tranquility that we have within our mind. This is kind of the calmness of the lake that occurs after the vrittis subside. And so you need the spiritual practice to do that. You really need to be sincere about your spiritual practice to calm the mind and get rid of that restlessness. But as I said, we live in a society today that is constantly gearing us towards activity, making us do a lot of things, maybe to gain money or gain fame or so forth and so on, right? Or just even take care of your family. There's a lot of things that society is trying to push you to do. And unfortunately, as our society has evolved, it's become increasingly complex, and we are losing simplicity day by day. And that's why as you get older, you remember how simple it was when you were a child and that sort of phase of your life. And that's why we hear a lot of old people say, oh, it was better in the old days. What they're really talking about is a simplicity that is missing from the current complexity. And this continues generation to generation. So it is always simpler in the past as opposed to the present, especially due to technology and since the Industrial Revolution. So there are a lot of things that we actually don't think about, right? We don't think about that when we look at our current world. And so in our spiritual practice, we need to be focused on trying to get rid of that restlessness. We have to cultivate our life in a certain way that we're not going to agitate our mind with all of this incessant activity, because that is what keeps the ego alive, that incessant activity, because the ego then ruminates on this activity in your mind and believes this activity and begins to act from that activity. So you might be thinking about something that actually is not really any of your concern, but you think it's something of your concern, and you begin to act from that place, but it has nothing to do with you directly. You might have heard something on the news or so forth and so on, and then that affects the way that you experience your life. And we see this a lot, right? A lot of people do this, particularly with social media. People get so mad on social media because they might have read someone's post, who they don't know, mind you, and then that really triggers them, and then they begin to act from the vrittis. They have no level of shamatha. If you have a level of shamatha, you can just read over anything and then just move on. This is why when people see pictures of Ramana Maharshi and they say, well, Ramana read newspapers every now and again. He did, but he was reading them from the place of the self, of the Atman. And it was just like he could read it and not be attached or moved emotionally by what he was consuming. And we need to get to that place as well. So then we can then experience life without emotions and not be triggered by this and that, right? In the traditions, we are supposed to emulate the Tao, emulate Brahman. And so to emulate the ultimate reality, we cannot be overly emotional. And so to be less emotional, we have to work on this restlessness. We have to work on the vrittis. We have to calm the vrittis down, and we have to come back to shamatha. We have to calm those waters. And so that's where the spiritual work begins. So you have to notice within yourself if you are restless. Like, are you waking up in the morning and the first thing you do is check your email? Even though you know you should be practicing Tai Chi Chuan or you should be practicing Zazen. But you got to see that email. You are infected then by restlessness. You are infected by the vrittis. And we've all been there. We've all been there. Trust me. Even a master has been there. But it's an ongoing process to get rid of that restlessness. You can check that email, but you can check it in time, right? You don't need to get around to it immediately. It's like when someone says something to us and we think we need to react immediately to the situation, especially if it's a very sensitive topic. I always like George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's grandfather's advice. Gurdjieff's grandfather said to him, if someone says something to you that triggers you and you want to react immediately, pause and stop and come back in 24 hours and see if you even need to give any input. And if you need to give input, you've at least have had 24 hours to digest what has been said and to probably state your case in a more pure manner as opposed to reacting immediately. And so that kind of relates to, we spoke about before, Guyang and I, about the 2-minute rule, about, leaving that little gap. But Gurdjieff's grandfather takes it a step further and says 24 hours. But this has a big effect on restlessness because you'll notice in your body that your fingers might twitch. You might have a sensation in your brain to react immediately. But if you just pause and watch that for a second, you'll watch in an hour or two, it'll start to subside and those tranquil waters will begin to surface. And so that's what you really need to see. You really need to see that restlessness within you. And you can notice it because you can feel it within your psychosomatic organism. You can feel that restlessness. If you notice yourself tapping your foot or tapping your finger on the table, stop it and observe that. Observe that habit. Or if you're scratching or you feel like anxiety rising, observe the anxiety rising into your mind and just be a witness to that, because you need to start working on the restlessness aspect of the ego to get to any deeper levels, especially of the original face. And this is why it's very important for our spiritual practice. So remember, the vrittis constantly are turned on if we continue to feed them. So the less we feed them, the more we will have a state of shamatha. So if you're constantly looking at your news feed on your phone or you're constantly watching TV, or people these days, they have a phrase, what do they say? They say Netflix and chill, when in actual fact, you're not really chilling because you're still feeding the mind full of, in most cases, garbage. So you want to refrain from that. You want to really refrain from that and start to observe yourself. Because if you're serious on the spiritual path, you need to turn that volume down on the vrittis and you need to come back to that level of shamatha. And the way to do that is through sincere meditation and through observing yourself, observing the way you react to the world and you react to your own emotions. That's what's most important. And so guys, I hope you enjoyed this 4th episode of the Dissolving the Ego series, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.